Hi there, I'm Clyde, and, well, I suppose this is another one of those very calm, rather uneventful stories from my travels through time. I'm a sleepy sort of fellow. I travel here and there, whenever my stone hums in my coat pocket, and I find myself somewhere else, somewhere old, or sometimes not so old, and usually rather quiet. You've stumbled upon one of my boring adventures. I say boring in the nicest possible way, of course. Nothing much happens, and that's exactly the point. If you'd like to join me for more sleepy stories like this one, you can find all my adventures in the playlist, each one designed to help you drift off gently, like a breeze through lace curtains. So go ahead and like and subscribe now, before your eyes get too heavy and you forget. And if you decide to become a channel member, not only would that help me keep the candle burning on this little project of mine, but I'll also write a personalized sleepy story just for you. Your name, your setting, your very own tale, calm as can be. All right, let's begin. Today we're heading to a beautiful old Victorian train station, where I'll be doing something quite important. Or maybe not important at all. I'll be counting ceiling tiles, one by one, and we'll see where that takes us. The first thing I noticed when I arrived was the light. Not sunlight exactly, although it streamed politely through the high arched windows, but rather the light as it filtered down through layers of soot-flecked glass. The great iron canopy above the station was fitted with long panels of dusty skylights, and the sunlight arrived softened, strained through years of steam and smoke, as if the whole ceiling were a tea bag steeping in the golden afternoon. I stood still for a moment, my boots just barely clicking against the old tile floor. It was the kind of place where sounds didn't echo sharply but gently ricocheted around with the hush of thick coats and long shadows. A quiet kind of bustling. The Victorian train station was just large enough to feel impressive and just empty enough to feel restful. A man in a brown suit read a newspaper by the timetable board. A couple of porters leaned against a wall with canvas sacks at their feet, not speaking, not rushing. Somewhere, a kettle whistled faintly from a tea cart I hadn't yet spotted. I made my way toward the center of the platform where an old wooden bench sat, polished smooth by 100 years of waiting. That's where I decided to sit. Just sit. I hadn't come here for anything in particular. The stone hadn't told me why. It never does. It had hummed in my coat pocket while I was still in Alexandria. I'd been halfway through a cup of mint tea. And then I'd blinked. And now I was here. This station, these floors, this roof that looked like a ribcage of iron and glass, stretching over the air like a metal sky. As I sat and looked up, I realized I could see nearly all of the ceiling tiles from my seat. Little square ones, laid out like a biscuit tin tray. Some were slightly askew, one or two looked newer than the rest. I couldn't help but wonder who replaced those, and when. That's when I began counting them, not out loud, just with my eyes, following each row across the grid, moving slowly like a tortoise in no hurry to reach the end. Row 1. 17 tiles. Row 2. 17. A perfect match. Row 3. One was chipped on the corner, shaped like a crooked tooth. I smiled at that. This was going to take a while, and I didn't mind at all. I had just finished the 7th row of ceiling tiles, 18 across, though one looked suspiciously smaller, as if it had been trimmed to fit around a pipe that no longer existed, when a soft fluttering caught my attention. A pigeon, or at least something with feathers and very little regard for personal space. It landed a few feet from the bench, blinking at me as if I were in its seat. Its little head bobbed this way and that, and then it gave a brief, cooing sigh before settling down as if it too planned to stay a while. I gave it a respectful nod. The train station seemed perfectly content to let life drift through slowly. A gentleman in a grey wool coat walked past carrying a paper parcel that smelled unmistakably of warm pastry. Perhaps something filled with meat and gravy, or maybe apple and cinnamon. He left behind the softest trail of steam in the cool air. Somewhere behind me, a clock chimed the half-hour. The chime was elegant, not rushed, more of a thoughtful ting than a commanding bell, like it was suggesting, rather than announcing, the passage of time. The pigeon looked up at the sound, then returned to watching me with what I could only describe as mild curiosity. I resumed counting. Row 8, row 9. 17 tiles. 18. 17 again. I couldn't tell if the pattern was supposed to be consistent or if there had been some minor rebellion among the tilers long ago. It didn't matter, of course. Not to the ceiling. Not to the pigeon, and not to me. After a while, the man with the pastry came back. His coat slightly more unbuttoned now, his parcel no longer steaming. He took a seat at the other end of my bench without saying a word. We sat in quiet companionship, two travelers with nowhere to be just yet. He unwrapped a bit of the paper and took a careful bite, the crinkle of waxed paper sounding unusually loud in the calm. He didn't offer me any. That was fine. I hadn't expected him to. But the pigeon? The pigeon was definitely hopeful. The man glanced at it, tore off a tiny corner of the crust, and flicked it gently onto the floor. The pigeon blinked again, as if insulted by the size of the offering, and then waddled over to investigate. That's how the three of us spent the next little while. Me with my ceiling, the man with his pastry, and the pigeon with its moral dilemma. After a time, the man beside me finished his pastry, brushed the last flakes from his lap, and folded the brown paper carefully, like it might be reused. He tucked it into his coat pocket and gave a small sigh, one that felt practiced, the kind that came not from sadness exactly, but from years of sighing. The pigeon had wandered off by then, apparently unimpressed. The man turned to me and asked, without preamble, "Waiting for someone?" I considered the question. "No," I replied, "just counting ceiling tiles." He looked up. Ah, there was a pause. Then he added, "Makes sense." That was the entire conversation, and it was perfect. He pulled something from his waistcoat then, an old pocket watch, chain dangling like a lazy question mark. He popped it open, checked the face, and held it to his ear. After a moment, he shook it lightly and muttered something about springs. "It doesn't tick," he said, as if apologizing. "But it still tells time, I think, out of habit." He closed the case with a snap and tucked it back into his vest like he'd never expected it to work in the first place. I wondered if maybe the station's big clock was the same, moving not because it had to, but because it had always done so. Above us, a lone bird, a different one, smaller than the pigeon, fluttered across the glass ceiling beams and disappeared behind one of the iron arches. I turned my gaze back up and resumed the count. Rows 10 through 14 were slightly off kilter, sagging just enough to make a person tilt their head. "Did you know," the man said suddenly, There's a tile up there with a crack shaped like the River Thames. I looked over at him. He was already standing. Third row from the far side. Look for the one next to it that looks like a camel. Can't miss it. Then, with a little nod, he walked away, his coat flaring gently behind him like a curtain catching a draft. I watched him go until he turned the corner past the ticket counter and was gone. I turned back to the ceiling, eyes scanning carefully. I never did find the camel, but I think I saw the river. The station had grown a little quieter, or maybe it hadn't. Maybe I had simply grown quieter inside. That happens sometimes, when the rhythm of a place begins to match the rhythm of your own thoughts, like an orchestra that slowly tunes itself to your breathing. I looked down from the ceiling for a bit and stretched my legs out. My boots made a gentle scraping sound on the floor, and I became acutely aware of how polished the tiles were. Not sparkling clean, no, but worn smooth by thousands of steps. You could almost hear them if you tried. The ghosts of shoes, leather ones, wood-soled ones, rubber galoshes, high heels on business trips, bare feet in emergencies. My gaze wandered across the station and came to rest on a wooden cabinet tucked near the wall, a glass-fronted box with a brass label above it. Lost property. It had the look of something rarely visited, but respectfully maintained. Inside the case were a handful of forgotten items, a red woolen mitten, a folded umbrella with a cracked handle, a book with no title on the cover, a metal tin, possibly for biscuits or shoe polish, a small wooden duck, brightly painted and clearly once beloved. I stood up slowly and made my way across the platform. The pigeon was gone, and so was the man with the watch. Even the light had shifted, like a theater set changing scenes without anyone noticing. I stood in front of the glass. The cabinet didn't open, at least not from this side. But I didn't need it to. I wasn't there to claim anything. I was just curious. I tried to imagine the stories behind each item. The mitten had been dropped by a child tugging impatiently on a parent's arm. The umbrella, perhaps left behind in frustration after it failed its one job during a sudden storm. The book, maybe deliberately left. A quiet act of rebellion against the ending. And the duck. I didn't know. But I hoped the child who'd lost it had found something else to hold on to. I stood there a while longer than I expected to. Long enough for the ceiling to begin calling me back. Not audibly, of course, but with the pull of unfinished counting. I turned away and headed back to my bench, ready to pick up where I'd left off. Row 15, I thought. Only a few dozen to go. When I returned to the bench, I found a teacup sitting exactly where I'd been. It was delicate, porcelain with a pale blue rim, and resting on a small saucer that had the faintest chip along the edge, like a bite taken long ago. There was no note, no owner in sight. Just steam rising gently from whatever had been steeped within. I looked around, but the platform was near empty. The ticket man had stepped away. The luggage cart was still. A faint rustle of a newspaper echoed from a far bench, too far to be responsible. There was something about the cup that made it feel trusted. As if it had been left for me. Or maybe not for me exactly, but for anyone who might sit down and notice it. I sat carefully beside it and gave it a polite nod. The steam smelled faintly of bergamot and lavender. A very calming combination. I resumed counting, row 15, tile by tile, tracing the lines with my eyes, allowing the occasional drift into thought. The kind of soft drifting that turns numbers into memories. 16. 17. A whisper interrupted me. Not loud. Not even meant for me. Just the soft sound of two women passing behind me, their conversation barely louder than the steam from the teacup. "I always like this station," one of them said. "The ceiling makes me feel like I'm inside a cathedral made for travel." I like that. I like that very much. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. The sound of their footsteps faded, and the hush of the station settled again. I looked at the cup, then back up. I began wondering if maybe someone else had been counting these tiles long before I arrived. Maybe they'd even left the teacup here when they reached a satisfying number and decided it was time to go. That idea made me smile. I didn't sip the tea. I just let it be. After a while, the steam stopped rising. The cup stayed warm longer than it should have. I started row 16. By the time I reached row 17, I'd begun to notice a rhythm. Not just in the spacing or the count, but in the subtle imperfections that gave the tiles character. A ripple in the plaster here, a faint stain shaped like a feather there. One tile had a single circular mark near the edge, as if someone had rested a cup of tea on it 100 years ago. Maybe the very same cup now beside me. I adjusted my seat slightly, shifting to avoid a small splinter in the bench I hadn't noticed before. The sun had moved again, now slanting through the uppermost panes and casting light like cathedral beams across the dusty air. Dust motes floated lazily through the shafts, moving as if underwater. That's when I saw it, the tile that wasn't there. Right at the edge of the 19th row, far toward the right-hand corner, one square was not a tile at all, but a patch. A metal plate, rusted ever so slightly, held in place with 4 incongruous screws that sparkled as if they'd been added last week. It threw off the rhythm, and I found that oddly comforting. A ceiling without a mistake would be too perfect to believe. Too smug. This was real. A repaired thing, a work in progress that no one had bothered to finish with flair. I raised one hand and pointed toward it, though no one was around to see. Just to mark the moment for myself. The teacup was still warm. Somewhere far off, a train whistle blew, low and distant, not part of my story, but brushing up against it just enough to be noted. I thought again about the man with the broken watch. Maybe he'd seen the patch too. Maybe that's why he left when he did. Maybe he had found what he was looking for. A ceiling doesn't have to be beautiful. It just has to hold. And this one, it held. I resumed counting. Row 20. I'd lost track slightly, but it didn't matter. The numbers were less important than the noticing. I didn't hear the announcement, but I felt it. A soft crackle from an old speaker overhead, the kind that always sounds like it's speaking from the bottom of a well. Then a chime, a gentle ding-ding, followed by something that might have been words, but arrived scrambled and distant, like the voice had been translated through fog. No one moved. That's how I knew it wasn't for now. It was for someone else. Some other time. Maybe even a memory. Still, I looked toward platform 3 and it was empty, as expected. No one stood waiting, no train pulled in or out. But there was something comforting about its stillness. A few benches lined the platform. A forgotten newspaper rustled in a passing breeze that no one felt. A small cart with empty crates sat near a post with a cracked sign that read, "To London," though the arrow pointed firmly at a wall. I walked over slowly. Teacup left behind, though I gave it a parting glance, half expecting someone to sit beside it as I left. The floor tiles changed as I stepped onto platform 3. Slightly darker, more worn. I wondered if this platform had seen more feet, or simply older ones. A man could tell the history of a place by how the floor felt beneath his boots. I sat on a different bench this time, just under a wide archway. From here, I could see the ceiling again, but from a new angle. It reminded me of shifting in bed to see the moonlight better through the curtain. A train didn't arrive, nor did I expect one. The only sound was the flutter of another bird, high up in the beams, and the echo of a footstep that might have been my own. I rested my arms along the back of the bench and looked up once more. This view gave me access to an entirely different grid of tiles. Ones I hadn't seen from my original seat. A whole new ceiling. And so, I began counting again. I don't know how long I stayed there on platform 3. Time had lost its shape. It no longer moved in straight lines, but in soft ripples, circling slowly around my bench, brushing against the floor tiles, lifting gently toward the ceiling. It wasn't passing so much as stretching. The quiet here was different than the quiet near the main hall. That quiet had been filled with waiting. This one felt like remembering. Somewhere behind me, a distant click of shoes tapped once, then stopped. I didn't turn around. It felt like a memory trying to sneak past without being seen. I leaned back and let my eyes roam the ceiling once more. This section had more color. Stained glass insets set like forgotten windows into the roof. Most were soft amber, but a few glowed pale green or dusty rose, warming the light that filtered down onto the platform. It made the air feel heavier in a pleasant way, like an old wool coat pulled over the shoulders. A breeze stirred, just enough to send the corner of a newspaper fluttering again, like it was trying to fly. Then I heard it. Very faint. A whisper of sound that could have been the wind or the whisper of a page turning. Or a sigh. Or a hello. I looked around. No one. A clock high on the arch read a time I didn't recognize. Possibly accurate, possibly ceremonial. My hand slipped into my pocket and found the stone. The smooth one that always felt like river-washed marble, humming faintly when it was ready. But it didn't hum now. It was still and quiet. Good, I wasn't ready yet. I shifted slightly on the bench to get a better look at a small section of ceiling I'd missed before. 3 tiles tucked under a beam, barely visible from my previous angle. I hadn't counted those yet. So I did. I spotted the suitcase when I stood to stretch. It was leaning against the far leg of one of the benches near the wall, half in shadow, half in sunlight. A sturdy thing, dark brown leather with brass corners and a faded tag tied to the handle. It looked heavy, though it might have been hollow. Some things carry weight without holding anything at all. There was no one nearby, no sign it had been recently placed. It felt left, not lost, not abandoned, just done with. I approached slowly, as if it might be startled. The tag had once been white, now yellowed with age. I bent slightly to read it and found only the remnants of ink. A name smudged into anonymity, an address blurred beyond recognition. A ghost of a journey. I sat beside it for a moment, not touching it, just sitting. There was something dignified about it, the way it leaned patiently, like a loyal dog waiting outside a shop. I wondered what it had seen. Perhaps it once traveled to Vienna or through foggy hills to Wales. Maybe it held poetry or old wool suits or stones gathered from seaside holidays. Perhaps it had never left this station at all. A breeze passed again, just enough to lift the corner of the tag and let it fall. That felt like punctuation. Behind me, the ceiling watched on, its tiles steady in their grid, their cracked edges and stains and patchwork repairs forming a mosaic of stillness. No one else seemed to notice them. That was fine. That was how ceilings preferred it. I returned to my bench and to my counting. I had no destination either, just the next tile. I didn't notice the shift in light until I blinked and realized the color of the ceiling had changed. Not the tiles themselves, of course. They remained steady in their grid, still gently dusty, still home to the occasional crack or off-white ripple. But the light falling on them had gone from amber to a kind of smoky lavender, like dusk had tiptoed in and curled itself around the beams. The colors deepened in the stained glass above, turning soft golds into honey and faded greens into moss. Those on the platform stretched and leaned like travelers who'd waited too long. I looked around and realized I was the only one left in sight. Even the suitcase was gone. That startled me a little, though I couldn't say why. I hadn't heard anyone take it. I hadn't seen anyone come or go. But I liked the thought that it had found its person, or that someone had finally remembered it. The great station clock had not changed in some time. Its hands seemed unsure whether to move forward or stay suspended between one tick and the next. I stood once more and stretched gently, feeling the weight of the quiet settle across my shoulders. My legs had stiffened just slightly. I hadn't moved much. I hadn't needed to. The counting had slowed, more wandering than methodical now. I'd lost the exact numbers somewhere between the forgotten tiles near platform 3 and the warm bend of light by the lost property case. And that was all right. There's no rule that says you have to finish. Sometimes you just notice. I slipped my hand into my pocket again, fingers brushing the stone. This time, it hummed. Quietly, like the tail end of a lullaby. And it was glowing faintly. The kind of glow that feels more like memory than light. I gave the ceiling one last look. Still holding. Still there. Then I turned slowly and walked toward the long corridor that led out of the station. Not rushing, not hesitating, just moving, like a shadow at the end of the day. Wherever I was going next, I'd probably count something else. But for now, Good night, ceiling.